What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of Sit Down Saturday. Today we're going to be doing our fourth installment of the Bayverse breakdown, which is on Age of Extinction, where things really start to go off the rails. But first, in typical fashion, you know what we have to talk about, and that is house cleaning. Couple things. A lot of people were asking about the Fans Toys Motormaster in regard to why we didn't go into combine mode. The reasons are, for one, there's no instructions on how to get there, and for two, it looks like it pretty much just turns into a block that goes inside of a parts forming piece a la Zeta Toys, which I think is the right choice. So without going into the casing, there's not a whole lot to show, even if I were to have gone through the trouble of trying to figure out how it's supposed to end up. We will cover that when we can and when it's appropriate. Now's just not the time. Secondly, last week's Sit Down Saturday on where the test shots have gone. A lot of people said they think it's because companies are trying to protect what they're creating from other people seeing their designs. I'm not sure I buy that, and I'll tell you why. They could still send the stuff out like and I'm not saying I want them to send it out. I don't care what they do. I just think it's interesting that it's changed, but they still could send it out about 3 weeks prior to release, just as like basically free advertising, and wouldn't run the fear of somebody stealing their design. They wouldn't have enough time to be effective in that manner. So I'm not sure I buy into that, but there were some other interesting theories that I read in the comments there. And like I said, I'm not sure that any of the reasons I brought up are the reasons why. I'm speculating for the sake of speculating. Now, let's get into this movie, Age of Extinction, the movie that killed the franchise for my daughter, which will always sting a bit. And we'll start with the plot. So the plot of this thing is that 65 million years BC, the creators, as they're called, came and terraformed, or as they call it, cyberformed Earth, causing the extinction of the dinosaurs and creating a metal that was then harvested in order to use for the sake of creating the Transformers themselves. This event was discovered by a new company that we're now following called KSI. Speaking of new, we're also introduced to an entirely new cast of characters, the Yeager family, namely Cade and Tess. But Cade comes included with a useless tag-along friend that only dies a half hour into the film after alerting the government, which is only his real plot device, as to the location of the Transformers, which we'll circle back to. Tess also comes with a tag-along, a boyfriend. Now, Cade is our main character, and he's just a regular man. He's a working man. He puts his pants on one leg at a time. I'm sure you can relate to him. He's going through financial struggles just like you are. But he still has time to work out with a personal trainer in order to keep a tip-top physique. And he discovers Optimus Prime as a truck in a theater and buys him to take him home. Prime eventually wakes up and befriends Cade, but Cade's friend tattles on them to the government for a rumored reward for information. This causes our first real conflict and for our main cast and Autobots to kind of get on the run. There's some other information that we learn though in the first act. The Autobot-human alliance has ended, and the humans have been hunting down the robots along with a new character that we're also introduced to, Lockdown, who is working with the CIA in a relatively secret regard, or as they describe it, Black Ops, for a mutually beneficial deal, which will reward Lockdown with a Prime and reward the CIA with what they call the Seed, which is our new MacGuffin. During this, we see Ratchet die. We also learn about a relationship between the CIA and the KSI, where they are working hand in hand in order for Kelsey Grammer to eventually retire from the CIA and live as a wealthy shareholder slash philanthropist and entrepreneur. But in order to do this, they're going to need the Seed from Lockdown to create more Transformium, which we'll get to here shortly. Lockdown only needs Prime because the creators want him back, and we're not entirely sure what that means at this point. Meanwhile, after evading capture, Prime and the Autobots reunite. I say reunite loosely as it's only described in the film as being a reunification, but we haven't really seen these characters before, and it feels ultra weird when Hound says, "The gang's back together." What? When has this gang been together? We then enter our major second act conflict, which is learning that KSI has made Galvatron out of parts from Megatron and seemingly has control, but something seems out of place. The reason why I say something doesn't seem quite right is because we learn that Megatron has been manipulating the Transformium and KSI into thinking they were in control when in fact they never were. But we'll get back to that later. Cade breaks into KSI, gets caught, and the Autobots trash it, and everyone escapes. But before they do, there is an interesting scene where Prime draws down on a human, the head of KSI, and he says, "Show us your true colors once and for all," which becomes a bit prophetic. But they all escape from the building, only shortly to be captured by Lockdown, who mainly captures Prime and Tess. During this scene on Lockdown's ship, where Prime and Tess were taken, we learn about the Knights who were Crusaders, which is another element of this lore and mythology that we haven't really been exposed to until this point. But it turns out that Lockdown has captured a lot of these Knights. I guess the Knights Knights and the Dinobots are one and the same, but it's a little hard to distinguish. And they've also captured Count Dracula, I think, or some sort of weird vampire creature with a long tongue. But of course they are rescued and have to escape from that ship. The humans escape with Bumblebee. Optimus Prime separates his area of the ship from the larger Lockdown ship, and Lockdown takes off into space. We then enter around the 1 hour and 45 mark, where the seed now becomes the main element of the plot. The seed was always there in the story, but it now becomes the focus, which in my opinion is a little late for that sort of thing, but now's not the time for that either. But it's all about the seed. Galvatron officially goes rogue, and the end battle finale becomes a showdown in Hong Kong with Galvatron versus the KSI versus the Autobots versus Lockdown versus the CIA versus the Chinese government. And the Dinobots are now part of the Autobot crew. The Dinobots make their debut at 2 hours and 13 minutes, properly, which is a little late for all that marketing material, in my opinion. The end battle ensues, the good guys win, the bad guys lose. In the process, Prime kills Kelsey Grammer by sneak attack, shooting him in the side of the body and face, and stabs Lockdown in the back, literally, and rips him in half. Galvatron retreats, the Dinobots run off into the woods, and Optimus uses his space boots to go find the creators. And that's how this movie concludes. So, as we've kind of been establishing here, we're going to do this in a compliment sandwich in reverse. We'll call it a criticism sandwich. The bad. One thing about the bad in this movie that we have to comment on is the fact that we are starting new 4 films into the franchise. The problem with this is that when you start laying down sequels, you want to get to the heart of the conflict and get into it. But because this is an entirely different cast with no Sam Witwicky, because that guy went nuts, we spend a large amount of this movie establishing a whole new cast of characters. So in essence, you're basically starting from scratch. And you can't rely on the Transformers in order to kind of just continue your storytelling, because you've never really used them as storytelling devices in the first place. In many ways, they back themselves into a corner. Speaking of backing themselves into a corner, they stay consistent in the idea that there's far too many moving pieces. There's the KSI, the CIA, the Autobots, the Dinobots, Lockdown, Galvatron, all of these moving pieces, and you don't really need them in order to tell this story. You could probably rewrite this story very quickly and make it a simple conflict between Lockdown and Optimus Prime. Lockdown working for whatever the creators end up being, Optimus Prime defending Earth and the Autobots and himself from Lockdown. That's all you need. Never in the history of this particular movie franchise has the human story really been so unnecessary, because we just had to introduce you to new characters that you're not really engaged with. They give you a ton of characters, but don't really use any of them in any effective manner to tell the story quickly. This movie's 2 hours and 45 minutes, and we don't really get to the final battle until 2 hours and 15 minutes, which already seems like a secondary final battle after the spaceship scene, which is probably the logical place for that movie to have ended. So that's what I mean by an ineffective use of resources. It's like you have 5 things that need to get done, and you decided to hire 20 people to do those 5 things, when you only needed to hire 5 people. We also get full-blown murder Prime, and he brought along his murder bot friends, shooting agents at the farm, saying things like, "I'm going to tear them apart in regard to the humans. I'm done defending humans." This ties back to what we started to see in the 3rd movie, where they lost control of what makes this character this character. Now, in last time's episode, I remember hearing a lot of people in the comments say, "Oh, PTSD, Prime's at the end of his rope." All of this explains and forgives why he would be an executioner. And maybe that's a generational thing. Maybe that's younger people growing up with a different Prime and not seeing that character or understanding that character the way that a lot of us older people do. Prime is the never faltering leader. It's what makes him him. He's larger than life. He's a Superman-esque character without the superpowers. He makes the right decision. His loyalty and his caring and his willingness to defend the weak are never compromised. It's what makes me love him. It's what makes many love him. It's what puts him on the pedestal. You take away that, you take away the pedestal, and now he's no different from any other anti-hero with a gun. He's more valiant than that. And not only is he murderous Prime, but he's also contradictory Prime, where he's so worried about freeing the Dinobots from their captivity and slavery that he says, "Join me or I'll kill you." It's just, what is this? Who is this character? It's tragic. Also in this movie, we see the beginning of Bumblebee starting to be treated like a pet. This carries on and gets worse, and we'll talk about that when we get there, but this is where it really starts. Now for the good. There are some good moments to this. For one, the robots are probably the most identifiable they've ever been. They're starting to look like solid structures instead of the pile of moving parts, right? They're starting to take proper shape, and then therefore having a strong identification and iconic look and character attached to that presence. That's important. It's something they've screwed up on many of the films, but they really start to lock it down here, no pun intended. But speaking of lockdown, I think he's cool. I think he's a cool character. I have no attachment to him, but I think he adds an interesting element to the story and the mythology. His voice is awesome. The design is cool enough. And the fact that he exists in this area that's not Decepticon and not Autobot is interesting to me. I think he adds something to this instead of detracts. There's also a small scene at the end of the movie where Galvatron says something to the effect of, we'll meet again, or another time, Prime, or something along those lines, and two jets like fly over his shoulder in the distance. Gives you those feels. There's something about that that does feel like Transformers to me. I can't necessarily identify what makes that scene different from another, but there is something about it that kind of strikes true, for lack of a better term. So the Dinobots. The Dinobots are cool. They're always cool to see. I even like the new Dinobot character, like the Spinosaurus one. Like somehow I'm like, okay, I'm accepting. I'm accepting you into the group. It's one of those things that I think I never thought I'd see on the big screen, and even though I think they were poorly used in this movie, I do think that they were fun to watch. And I kind of dig the Lex Luthor syndrome that goes on with the humans. Even though I think the human story isn't necessary, especially for this one, I do feel like that Lex Luthor thing of like protecting the world from the alien, even though the alien says it has good intentions, with that sort of power behind it, you can't trust it, you can't put your faith in it or rely on it because you don't know it, and at any moment it could turn on you. Like, I think that's a cool thing to kind of introduce into the world of Transformers. Also, there's not a lot of the potty humor in this one. They got rid of most of it. However, they make up for the lack of potty humor by justifying statutory rape, which is completely unnecessary. You just make the dude 17. There's nothing about that character that needs to be any older than 17. If she's 17 and we're going to believe that that's what a 17-year-old girl looks like in Texas, there's no reason to suggest the same for him. It's silly, it's stupid, it's distracting, and it's a waste of time. It's just a completely unnecessary component to a children's franchise. Which kind of brings us into the ugly, which is the real dinosaurs at the beginning that die at the extinction due to the cyberforming or terraforming. The CG on them is really bad. Also, the CG on the Transformium, not great either. And the Transformium in general is stupid. It's just lazy. Like, they got to a point where they don't even want to turn them into a car. Like, just, I don't know, dude. Turn them into some bricks or something and put them in, I don't know. Just, like it's Tetris now. There's more Autobot roughhousing, which just drives me nuts. I just don't get it and find it to be irritating. There's a scene early on where Prime is still injured, obviously, and he spews this green fluid from his mouth. Maybe it's radiator fluid, who knows what it is. But why not just make it pink? Like the purplish pink energon. Like, why not just throw that little bone? That's just one of those little things you can do for some fan service, and still it doesn't get in the way of whatever story it is that you decided is better. That you arrogantly decided was better, that has stood the test of time for 30 years because you think you know better. That story. Tess's boyfriend's accent goes in and out of American and Australian. I've never noticed it until this time watching it, but it's especially noticeable in the scene where they're sitting around the campfire, the gang's back together scene. He's like, well, what's a KSI? Like, it's like super duper, like putting on the Ritz Australian. Like, it's Australian with some sauce on it. And in other scenes, it's totally American, but the more kind of emotional he gets, and the more he breaks out of it. And then the last ugly thing that we have to talk about is the marketing for this film. These movies have made a habit of tricking the nostalgic fan into thinking there's going to be something for them, and this one was no different. It used the Dinobots as its major marketing plan. If you look at the marketing material, it was always Prime on top of Grimlock. It's called Age of Extinction, which, the word extinction's obviously tying into the dinosaur concept, and all of the trailers, all had the Dinobot element in it, and all of that works in tandem to suggest that this is going to be a movie where the Dinobots are really a part of it, but they don't really serve a big purpose. They help turn the tide, but only because it's kind of more fighters on the side of the good guys. That whole Hong Kong fight, I'm not even really sure is needed for the film. You probably could have wrapped everything else up in the battle on Lockdown ship and been done with it. But I know they were worried about international money, so they had to have the Hong Kong sequence, and I like the Hong Kong sequence, so I guess ultimately I'm glad it's in. in, but I think it made the movie worse. It made the movie longer. The battle at the end becomes exhausting because you're sitting through so much of it, and it's just so repetitive and similar of things bumping into things and shooting bullets and other things falling down, and it just becomes like a circus. And you're exposed to it for about 45 minutes. It's too much. It's too much and yet not enough. And what I mean by that is it's too much of the same thing over and over. It's just not done well. But it was super disappointing that the Dinobots were used so sparingly and didn't really serve a heavy plot point. It's a bummer and a wasted opportunity. Now let's wrap it up by talking about this timeline. The only thing that we really get is that the creators came here at 65 million BC, which caused the extinction of the dinosaurs and the creation of the Transformers. That's kind of what I'm getting at. And this timeline gets even worse in the next one. This is the movie where everything starts to fall apart. This whole franchise as the Bayverse, even though I'm not really a fan of any of it, would have been, I think, more fondly remembered and more concise and more sort of respectable in the sense of something to table in a discussion of whether or not it has value without 4, 5, and then the loosely knit Bumblebee thing that we'll talk about when we get there. That's it for this one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Until next time, take care.